A barren she-wolf has only one destiny in the Silver Pine Pack, the auction block. When my own mother locked the heavy iron collar around my neck, she didn't weep. She merely calculated the silver my cursed life would fetch. In our brutal medieval kingdom, a wolf without a womb is nothing but walking meat. Tossed into the freezing mud of the flesh markets, I waited for a cruel slaver to buy my wretched existence for copper pennies. I never expected the jeering crowd to fall dead silent, and I certainly never expected the terrifying Alpha King of the North to buy a broken, empty girl for a king's ransom. The medieval village of Oakhaven was a miserable stretch of cobblestone and rot, overshadowed by the looming threat of the dark forests beyond. For Abigail Sterling, it had always been a cage, but today it was her execution block. Rain drove down in icy sheets, turning the town square into a muddy pit. Abigail stood on a wooden platform originally built for town criers, her thin, coarse linen dress clinging to her shivering frame. Her wrists were bound with rough hemp rope, biting into her pale skin. To her left stood Thomas and Martha Sterling, her parents. Thomas possessed a weak chin and a coward's posture, his eyes constantly darting toward the tavern doors. Martha was a woman hardened by years of harsh winters and a loveless mating, her face an unreadable mask of stone. "She is a strong worker," Thomas was saying, his voice raising over the crackle of thunder. He directed his pitch to Baron Godfrey, a hulking brute of an alpha from the marshlands, known for his savage temper and the mysterious deaths of his servants. "She can haul water, chop wood, and mend clothes. She won't cause you any trouble with unwanted pregnancies." The apothecary confirmed it. "Her womb is empty, cursed by the moon goddess. She'll never bear pups." Abigail closed her eyes, a solitary tear mixing with the freezing rain on her cheek. The apothecary's diagnosis 3 days ago had shattered her. She had always dreamed of a family, of holding a child against her chest and giving it the love she had been so violently denied. When the old healer shook his head and declared her barren, her parents hadn't mourned with her. They had instantly calculated her remaining market value. A fertile she-wolf could be married off for a decent dowry. A barren one was merely a drain on winter rations. 30 silver, Baron Godfrey grunted, stepping closer. His scent hit Abigail like a physical blow: stale ale, rotting meat, and wet dog. He reached up, his filthy fingers grabbing her chin and forcing her head to the side to inspect her teeth. "She's skinny, and if she's cursed by the goddess, she might bring blight to my lands. But I need hands in the quarry. 30 silver, Sterling and I take her right now." 40, Thomas pleaded, his voice trembling. "She's of good blood." 30, Godfrey growled, his eyes flashing a dangerous, muddy yellow. The wolf beneath his skin was rising, demanding submission. Thomas instantly cowered, exposing his neck in a pathetic display of surrender. 30 it is, Thomas whispered. Godfrey tossed the heavy leather pouch onto the muddy planks. The clink of the coins sealed her fate. Abigail felt the last shred of hope evaporate from her chest. She was property now, condemned to die in a marshland quarry. Godfrey yanked her rope, pulling her toward the edge of the platform. She stumbled, her knees hitting the rough wood. Suddenly, the air in the square shifted. The low, constant hum of the rain seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating, heavy pressure that forced the breath from the lungs of everyone present. The ambient chatter of the few villagers brave enough to watch the spectacle died instantly. A scent rolled over the square: sharp winter pine, crushed ice, and the ozone that followed a violent lightning strike. It was an alpha's scent, but not just any alpha. It was pure, unadulterated dominance. A line of 6 massive black direwolves trotted into the square, their golden eyes glowing in the gloom. Behind them, rode a man on a war horse the size of a draft beast, King Alistair Corvin of the Ironclad Territory. Abigail had only heard whispers of him. He was a ruthless warlord who had conquered the Northern Territories through sheer tactical brilliance and unmatched brutality. They said he had lost his mate years ago to a rival Pax assassin and had turned his heart to solid ice ever since. He was draped in a thick cloak of dark fur, his broad shoulders easily dwarfing the men around him. A jagged silver scar slashed across his left cheek, disappearing into a neatly trimmed dark beard. His eyes, a piercing, stormy grey, swept over the pathetic scene on the platform. Baron Godfrey immediately dropped Abigail's rope and dropped to one knee in the mud. Thomas and Martha scrambled to do the same. Even the villagers fell to their faces. Abigail, however, remained kneeling on the wood, frozen by the sheer intensity of the king's presence. "A slave auction in my borderlands?" King Alistair's voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the cobblestones. He didn't shout, yet every word demanded absolute obedience. "I outlawed the trading of our kind 3 winters ago, Godfrey." "My king," Godfrey stammered, his face pressed toward the mud. "She is not a slave. She is an indentured servant. Her parents sold her contract. She is barren, useless to the pack structure." Alistair's stormy gaze shifted from the quivering Baron to Abigail. She braced herself for disgust, for the pitying sneer she had seen on the faces of her neighbours. But Alistair's expression remained unreadable. He studied her soaked dress, her bruised wrists, and the defiant fire that still flickered weakly in her dark green eyes. "Baron," Alistair repeated, the word rolling off his tongue thoughtfully. He nudged his warhorse forward until it was parallel with the wooden platform. He looked down at Thomas Sterling. "How much did he pay you for her life?" 30 silver, Your Majesty," Thomas whimpered. Alistair reached into his heavy cloak and retrieved a pouch of deep red velvet. He tossed it casually. It hit Thomas directly in the chest, the heavy thud indicating it contained solid gold. 300 gold pieces, Alistair declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Her contract is mine, and if I ever see you trading flesh in my lands again, Godfrey, I will feed your heart to my hounds." Godfrey swallowed hard, nodding frantically. Thomas, eyes wide with greedy disbelief, clutched the gold to his chest. He didn't even look back at Abigail. "Bring her," Alistair commanded his guards, turning his horse back toward the northern road. "We ride for the Iron Keep." Abigail was hoisted to her feet by a massive, silent guard. Her mind spun in a frantic, terrifying circle. She had been saved from the quarry, but at what cost? What could a ruthless, widowed Alpha King possibly want with a broken, barren she-wolf? The journey north took 3 grueling days. Abigail was placed in a covered wagon, given a dry woolen blanket, and warm stew by the king's silent retinue. But she received no answers. King Alistair rode at the front of the column, a solitary, imposing figure wrapped in dark furs, his massive direwolves flanking him like shadows. He did not speak to her once. On the evening of the 3rd day, the Iron Keep came into view. It was a terrifyingly magnificent structure built directly into the side of a jagged mountain. Its towering walls were constructed from dark, volcanic stone, and heavy iron portcullises guarded its entrances. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting long, dancing shadows over the snow-dusted ground. It was a fortress designed for war, not for comfort. When the heavy wooden doors of the great hall slammed shut behind them, the sound echoed like a tomb. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, old parchment, and a lingering, heavy sorrow. Alistair finally turned to face her. He stripped off his soaked riding cloak, revealing a tunic of fine black leather and the heavy silver broadsword strapped to his waist. Up close, he was even more intimidating. The sheer power radiating from his wolf made Abigail's inner wolf lower its head in instinctual submission. "You are terrified," Alistair stated bluntly, his grey eyes piercing her. "You believe I brought you here to be a bed slave or a sacrifice." Abigail swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "My parents sold me for 30 silver because my womb is empty. You paid 300 gold. Men like you do not spend gold without expecting a massive return, Your Grace." A hint of surprise flickered in Alistair's eyes at her boldness, followed by something that almost looked like respect. "You are correct. I have a purpose for you, Abigail Sterling, and it is precisely because you are barren that I chose you." He gestured for her to follow him down a wide stone corridor. "I am a king, constantly at war. I have enemies beyond my borders and traitors within my court, but my greatest vulnerability is not my army. It is my bloodline." They stopped before a set of heavy, carved oak doors. "I have 4 children," Alistair said softly, and for the first time, the icy exterior cracked, revealing a profound exhaustion. Since their mother was murdered 5 years ago, they have known nothing but grief and instability. The nobles in my court have constantly tried to force me to take a new mate, to secure alliances. But any fertile she-wolf I take as a queen will inevitably desire pups of her own. She will see my current children as threats to her own offspring's claim to the throne. History is written in the blood of heirs murdered by ambitious stepmothers." Abigail's breath hitched. She was beginning to understand. "I needed a mate who could never bear her own children," Alistair continued, his gaze intense. "Someone who would have no reason to harbour political ambitions, no reason to view my children as rivals. I do not need a lover, Abigail. I need a mother for my heirs. I need someone to teach them, to protect them from the vipers in my court, and to bring life back into this stone grave." He pushed the heavy doors open. The room was a massive library, but it was in a state of absolute chaos. Books were thrown across the floor, ink was spilled over mahogany tables, and a tapestry hung half-torn from the wall. In the centre of the wreckage stood 4 children. The eldest, Cedric, was 14. He stood defensively in front of the others, his posture rigid, his eyes burning with a fierce, untamed yellow light. He held a heavy wooden training sword, pointing it directly at Abigail. Beside him stood Silas, 11, who was calmly, almost unnervingly, writing in a journal amidst the chaos, not even looking up. Behind them, clutching Silas's sleeve, was Freya, a tiny 7-year-old girl with matted dark hair and terrified, wide eyes. And on the floor, currently trying to eat the corner of a leather-bound history tome, was 4-year-old Leo. "Another one?" Cedric spat, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent rage. He glared at his father. "The last caretaker lasted 4 days before I put a snake in her bedding. What makes you think this peasant will last a week?" Alistair's jaw tightened. "Her name is Abigail. She is not a caretaker. I intend to make her your mother." Cedric let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "My mother is dead in the crypts. This is just another spy for the court or another gold digger." He levelled his wooden sword at Abigail's chest. "Leave now, peasant, before we break you like the rest of them." Abigail didn't flinch. She looked at the boy's hostile posture, recognizing the desperate, trembling grief beneath the anger. She looked at the quiet, detached Silas, the terrified Freya, and the wild little Leo. They weren't monsters. They were a pack of wounded, motherless pups, cornered and lashing out at the world. She stepped past Alistair, ignoring his warning growl, and walked directly toward the point of Cedric's wooden sword. The boy looked startled but held his ground. When the tip of the wood touched her sternum, she didn't stop, forcing him to take a step back or push it into her flesh. He stepped back. "I am not a spy, Cedric," Abigail said gently, her voice steady and calm. "And I have no gold to dig for. I was sold today, in a muddy square, for 30 pieces of silver. I have nothing. I have no family, no pack, and no future. She looked around the chaotic room. But I know what it feels like to be thrown away and forgotten. I know what it feels like to have no one in your corner. She slowly reached out and gently pushed the wooden sword down. I am not here to replace your mother. I am just here to make sure you don't have to fight the entire world by yourselves anymore. Cedric's jaw trembled. He violently yanked the sword away, turning his back to her. "Whatever," he muttered, stalking toward the window. But the absolute hostility in the room had fractured, just a fraction. Later that night, Abigail was given a chamber of her own, a stark contrast to the drafty attic she had slept in her whole life. The bed was a massive four-poster, with heavy velvet curtains and a feather mattress. A fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Yet, sleep evaded her. The sheer magnitude of her new reality kept her mind racing. Around 2 a.m, a sound pierced the silence of the stone corridors. It was a high, thin wail filled with absolute terror. Abigail threw off her covers, grabbing a woolen shawl, and hurried out the door. She followed the sound down the hall to the children's wing. The wailing was coming from the nursery. She pushed the door open to find little Leo thrashing in his bed, tangled in his blankets, screaming in his sleep. His small wolf was partially manifesting, his eyes glowing gold beneath his closed lids, little fangs baring in panic. Abigail rushed to his side. She knew the dangers of waking a panicked werewolf pup. Their claws could tear flesh instantly. Instead of shaking him, she sat on the edge of the bed and began to hum. It was an old, ancient melody, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing before the pack turned their backs on her bloodline. It was a song of the winter snows and the protective embrace of the moon goddess. She gently placed a hand on his chest, letting her own calm, steady heartbeat serve as an anchor. "Hush now, little warrior," she murmured. "The shadows cannot reach you. The pack stands guard." Slowly, Leo's thrashing subsided. His fangs retracted, and his breathing leveled out. He unconsciously rolled toward her, his small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. In the doorway, concealed by the deep shadows of the stone archway, King Alistair stood silently. He watched the scene with an expression he hadn't worn in 5 years. For the first time since his mate's death, the crushing weight of the keep felt just a little bit lighter. By her 4th week at the Iron Keep, Abigail had established a tenuous, fragile routine. She had learned quickly that forcing authority upon the royal children was a fast track to disaster. Instead, she acted as a quiet, immovable pillar in their chaotic lives. She sat with Silas in the library for hours, reading in comfortable silence while he furiously scribbled his observations of the castle staff. She braided Freya's hair, teaching the little girl how to weave dried lavender into the strands to keep the nightmares away. She chased Leo through the courtyards, letting him practice his pouncing on her heavily padded skirts. Only Cedric remained a fortress of thorns. He actively tested her. He replaced her morning tea with bitter wolfsbane, a mild irritant to an adult wolf, but deeply unpleasant. Abigail had smelled the sharp, acidic tang instantly. Instead of yelling, she had calmly poured the tea into a potted fern, while Cedric watched from the doorway, maintaining unbroken eye contact with him before pouring herself a glass of water. He had looked infuriated by her lack of a dramatic reaction. The true test came during the winter solstice feast. It was a political nightmare, where the highest-ranking lords and ladies of the territory gathered at the keep to pay their respects, and to subtly maneuver for power. Abigail had dressed modestly in a high-necked gown of deep emerald velvet, provided by the castle seamstresses. She stood near the hearth in the great hall, keeping a watchful eye on the children. Alistair was seated at the head table, engaged in tense negotiations with Lord Gideon, a powerful and highly ambitious beta from the eastern mountains. It was then that Lady Sybil approached. Sybil was a breathtakingly beautiful she-wolf, a daughter of a wealthy northern duke. She wore a dress of spun silver and possessed a smile that was entirely venomous. She had been vying for the king's bed for years, desperate to become the new queen. "So this is the king's new pet," Sybil purred loudly, drawing the attention of several nearby nobles. She looked Abigail up and down, her nose wrinkling in theatrical disgust. "I must say, I am surprised. Alistair has always had exquisite taste, yet he brings a mud-born commoner into the royal nursery." Abigail kept her face perfectly neutral. "Good evening, Lady Sybil. I am merely here to care for the children." "Care for them?" Sybil laughed, a sharp, glassy sound. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper, meant only for Abigail and the children standing behind her. "You are a barren freak, an empty vessel. What could a broken thing like you possibly teach the royal heirs? How to be defective? It's an insult to the memory of their true mother." Behind Abigail she heard Freya gasp, and a low, dangerous growl ripped from Cedric's throat. The boy stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to strike the noblewoman. Abigail moved faster. She stepped directly in front of Cedric, shielding him with her body, and locked her gaze onto Lady Sybil. The air around Abigail suddenly shifted. Though her wolf was suppressed, the sheer willpower of her human spirit flared with a terrifying intensity. "My womb may be empty, Lady Sybil," Abigail said, her voice crystal clear, ringing out over the sudden quiet of the hall. "But my heart is not. I would rather be an empty vessel than a poisoned well. Do not ever speak of their mother's memory to justify your own cruel ambitions, and if you ever insult these children in my presence again, you will find out exactly what a defective wolf is capable of." The hall went dead silent. Nobody spoke to a high-born lady in such a manner. Sybil's face flushed a violent, furious red. She raised her hand, fully intending to strike Abigail across the face. "Sybil!" The word cracked like a whip across the stone room. King Alistair was suddenly standing behind Abigail. He hadn't run. He had moved with the lethal, silent speed of an apex predator. His eyes were bleeding out their grey, replaced entirely by the glowing crimson of a furious alpha. "Touch her," Alistair growled, the vibration rattling the silver goblets on the tables. "And you will leave this keep without your hand." Sybil stumbled back, her arrogance shattering into pure terror. My king, she insulted me." "She defended my blood," Alistair corrected coldly. "Something you have never shown the slightest inclination to do. You are no longer welcome at this feast, Sybil. Leave." Humiliated, the noblewoman gathered her skirts and practically ran from the hall. Alistair turned to Abigail. For a brief second, the crimson faded from his eyes, leaving a look of profound, heavy gratitude. He didn't say a word, merely nodded, and returned to the high table. Abigail let out a shaky breath, turning back to the children. Silas was staring at her with wide eyes. Freya grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. And Cedric looked at her, truly looked at her, the hostility in his gaze replaced by a cautious, grudging respect. "You didn't have to do that," Cedric muttered, looking down at his boots. "I will always do that, Cedric," Abigail replied softly. Later that week, the adrenaline of the feast faded, replaced by a lingering, deep ache in Abigail's abdomen. It was a dull, persistent pain she had felt periodically since her parents sold her, which she had always attributed to the stress of her supposed barrenness. However, while trying to lift a heavy barrel of apples in the kitchens to help the staff, a sudden, blinding spike of agony dropped her to her knees. Alistair, who had been passing the courtyard, smelled her distress immediately. He carried her himself to the tower of the pack healer. Helga was an ancient, terrifyingly perceptive woman. She had served as the royal physician for 3 generations. She shooed the king out of the room, ignoring his furious growls of protest, and commanded Abigail to lay back on the examination table. Helga pressed her gnarled, herb-stained fingers against Abigail's stomach, her brow furrowing. She leaned down, closing her eyes, taking a deep, long breath, inhaling Abigail's scent at the most base, biological level. The old woman's eyes snapped open. "Who told you that you were barren, child?" "The apothecary in Oakhaven," Abigail rasped, wincing as Helga pressed a particularly tender spot. "He said the moon goddess cursed me." Helga let out a harsh, bitter cackle. "The moon goddess had nothing to do with this. Men and their greed did." Abigail's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Helga walked over to her wooden cabinets, pulling down glass vials. "You are not barren, Abigail. Your womb is perfectly healthy, or rather, it would be. You have been systematically poisoned." The room spun. Poisoned? Foxglove root, nightshade extract, and crushed weeping willow bark, Helga listed off, her voice grim. "It's a specific, highly illegal concoction known in the black markets as Maiden's Silence. It suppresses a she-wolf's heat, violently damages the reproductive lining, and masks her scent to make her appear infertile. It takes months of daily dosing to build up in the system." Abigail couldn't breathe. Months of daily dosing. The only person who prepared her meals every single day for the past year was her mother, Martha. "Why?" Abigail whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Why would my own mother do this to me?" "Money, debt, jealousy," Helga grunted, mixing a blue liquid in a mortar. "A barren wolf has no pack rights. She can be sold as cheap, indentured labor to clear debts without the High Council interfering. I suspect your parents owed a great sum to that brute Godfrey, and they sacrificed your body and your future to save their own skins." The betrayal ripped through Abigail deeper than any physical wound. Her own parents hadn't just sold her. They had meticulously broken her from the inside out to forge the very chains that bound her. Helga brought a steaming cup to Abigail's lips. "Drink this. It will flush the remaining toxins from your blood. It will be agonizing, child. But when it is done, your body will heal. You will be whole again." As Abigail drank the bitter brew, the heavy oak door creaked open. Alistair stood in the threshold, having clearly heard every word with his enhanced alpha hearing. His fists were clenched so tightly by his sides that his leather gloves were groaning. The fury radiating from him wasn't directed at Abigail. It was directed at the world that had dared to break her. He stepped to the side of the bed, his large, rough hand gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her forehead. "They will pay," Alistair whispered, a terrifying promise etched in stone. "Before the winter is out, they will pay in blood." But as the restorative medicine burned through her veins, Abigail realized a terrifying truth. If she healed, if she was no longer barren, she was no longer the safe, infertile caretaker Alistair needed. She would become the very threat to his children's succession he had sought to avoid. As the pain took her into darkness, her last thought was of the 4 broken children, and the king who had inadvertently bought a fertile queen. The purging of the Maiden's Silence from Abigail's blood took an agonizing fortnight. Fever dreams plagued her nights, filled with the scent of rotting willow bark and the phantom clinking of 30 silver coins. Yet, through the haze of pain, she was never truly alone. When she woke in the dimly lit infirmary, her sheets soaked in sweat, she would find Silas sitting quietly by the hearth, reading aloud from the journals of Sir Arthur Pendleton, a real historical archivist whose texts on medicinal flora grounded her fractured mind. Freya would leave clumsily woven lavender crowns on her pillow, and even Cedric, though he'd never admit it, stood guard outside the heavy oak doors, his posture rigid whenever the castle staff walked by. But as the poison left her system, something else returned. Her inner wolf, dormant and suffocated since her teenage years, began to stir. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, a phantom heartbeat syncing with her own. With it came the undeniable truth. She was healing. She was becoming a fertile, whole she-wolf. The realization sat like a lead weight in her chest. King Alistair had brought her here, specifically because she was an empty vessel. If the court discovered she could bear pups, the fragile peace she had built with Cedric and the others would shatter. They would see her as just another usurper, a woman waiting to replace them with her own bloodline. A week after she was cleared to leave the infirmary, the atmosphere in the Iron Keep shifted from mourning to a lethal, vibrating tension. King Alistair had made a promise in that healing room, and the Alpha King of the North did not make empty threats. Abigail was in the library, helping Silas translate an old Latin text, when the heavy war horns echoed through the courtyard. "They're back," Cedric said, stepping out from the shadows of the alcove. His yellow eyes were sharp, fixated on Abigail. "Father sent the vanguard a week ago. He said there was a rot in the southern marshes that needed burning out." Abigail's blood ran cold. She hurried to the arched windows overlooking the main courtyard. Below, amidst the flurries of heavy snow, Alistair's personal guard rode through the gates. Dragged behind two massive draft horses were heavy iron cages. Inside them, shivering, bruised, and covered in mud, were Thomas and Martha Sterling, along with the hulking, now cowering Baron Godfrey. "Abigail." Alistair's voice resonated from the library doorway. He stood there in his battle armor, his silver broadsword strapped to his back, his stormy eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "It is time." The great hall was packed with the nobility of the ironclad territory. Whispers hissed through the damp air like striking snakes as Abigail, flanked by Alistair and a surprisingly protective Cedric, walked to the dais. Thomas and Martha were thrown to the stone floor before the throne. Thomas was weeping openly, blabbering for mercy, his cowardice on full display. Martha, however, kept her head bowed, her lips pressed into a tight, bitter line. "Thomas and Martha Sterling," Alistair's voice boomed, carrying the absolute authority of an executioner's axe. "You stand accused of high treason against the crown, the illegal use of restricted banes, and the torture of a pack member. You poisoned your own daughter with maiden silence to forge a false medical ledger, branding her Baron so you could sell her as slave labor to Baron Godfrey and clear your gambling debts." A collective gasp ripped through the gathered lords and ladies. The use of maiden silence was universally reviled. It was an affront to the moon goddess herself. "Mercy, your grace," Thomas sobbed, pressing his forehead to the frozen stone. "We were starving. Godfrey threatened to burn our farm." "Lies," Helga the healer spat, stepping forward from the shadows, holding up a thick, leather-bound ledger. "I sent riders to the apothecary in Oakhaven, a Dr. Henry Cavendish. He surrendered his logs under threat of the king's justice. The Sterlings weren't starving. They were padding their pockets. They bought the poison themselves, administering it in the girls' morning tea for over 16 months. Abigail stared at her mother. The woman who had braided her hair as a child, who had taught her how to bake bread, had systematically destroyed her from the inside out. "Why?" Abigail's voice was barely a whisper, yet in the silent hall it carried perfectly. "Why did you hate me so much, Mother?" Martha finally looked up. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of any maternal warmth. "You were weak. Your wolf never manifested by your 18th winter. You were a runt, costing us food and bringing shame to our name. When Lord Blackwood's emissary offered us the gold to ensure you'd never breed, we took it." The entire hall froze. Alistair's hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. "Repeat that," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave into a monstrous, vibrating growl. Martha let out a bitter, raspy laugh. You think peasants like us knew how to brew maiden's silence? A cloaked man came to our village 2 years ago. He paid us in southern gold. He said his master, Lord Reginald Blackwood, was ensuring that any low-born she-wolf in the borderlands was sterilized. He was terrified that the king might take a commoner as a mate and muddy the royal bloodline. So he paid to have the poor poisoned. Chaos erupted. Lord Reginald Blackwood, a high-ranking duke who sat on Alistair's own advisory council, instantly turned pale. He bolted for the heavy oak doors, signalling his personal guards. "Treason!" Alistair roared, his wolf fully breaching the surface. In a terrifying display of predatory speed, Alistair leaped over the heavy wooden table. Before Blackwood could reach the exit, the king landed in front of him, his silver sword drawn and pressed directly against the duke's throat. "You sterilized the women of my lands to manipulate my throne," Alistair snarled, the air cracking with his alpha aura. But Blackwood, realizing he was a dead man, sneered. He let out a piercing, shrill whistle. Suddenly, the heavy stained glass windows of the great hall shattered inward. Dozens of rogue wolves, hired mercenaries paid by Blackwood's deep coffers, poured into the hall through the shattered windows. They were massive, scarred beasts, reeking of bloodlust and rebellion. Panic seized the nobility as lords and ladies scrambled for the exits, screaming as the mercenaries shifted into their monstrous wolf forms right on the stone floors. Alistair drove the hilt of his sword into Blackwood's temple, knocking the traitor out cold, and immediately engaged 2 massive grey rogues that lunged for his throat. His royal guards drew their steel, turning the great hall into a chaotic, bloody battlefield. "The children!" Abigail screamed over the din of clashing steel and snarling beasts. She spun around. Cedric had already drawn his hunting dagger, shoving Silas, Freya, and little Leo behind the heavy wooden throne chair. A massive, heavily scarred mercenary, a wolf the size of a black bear, spotted the royal heirs. The rogue's yellow eyes locked onto the pups, recognizing that killing the king's bloodline would earn him a fortune. The beast charged the dais. Cedric stepped forward, his young face pale but set in grim determination, raising his small blade. He was a brave boy, but against a fully grown, battle-hardened rogue, it was a death sentence. "No!" Abigail roared. She didn't think. The maternal instinct that had been mocked, poisoned, and sold surged through her veins like liquid fire. She threw herself between Cedric and the charging beast. As the rogue leaped, snapping its massive jaws toward her throat, something inside Abigail fundamentally snapped. The final, lingering chains of the maiden's silence shattered. Her suppressed inner wolf, denied for over a decade, erupted with a force that shook the stone beneath her feet. There was a blinding flash of silver light, accompanied by a sound like tearing silk. Abigail didn't fall. Instead, the rogue slammed into a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. Where the fragile, allegedly barren peasant woman had stood a second before, there was now a magnificent, breathtaking beast. She was a dire wolf of pure, luminous white, a coat like freshly fallen snow, untouched and brilliant. Her eyes burned with a fierce, ethereal emerald fire. In werewolf lore, a pure white wolf was an ancient anomaly, the mark of a true, destined Luna, blessed by the goddess herself. The great hall seemed to hold its breath. Even the fighting mercenaries hesitated, momentarily blinded by the sheer radiance of her coat. The scarred rogue recovered, shaking its head, and lunged again. Abigail's white wolf met him in mid-air. She wasn't trained in combat, but she was driven by a feral, unparalleled need to protect the pups cowering behind her. She moved with blinding speed, her jaws locking onto the rogue's thick neck. With a brutal, savage twist of her body, she threw the massive beast across the room, sending him crashing into a stone pillar where he lay motionless. She turned back to the dais, her emerald eyes locking onto Cedric. The boy was staring at her, his jaw slack, his dagger lowering. Behind him, Freya and Leo were looking at the giant white wolf, not with fear, but with absolute, wide-eyed awe. Abigail lowered her massive head, letting out a soft, rumbling purr, nudging Cedric gently to check for injuries. The boy, tears suddenly pricking his eyes, reached out a trembling hand and buried his fingers into her thick, white fur. You're a Luna," Cedric whispered, the realization washing over him. The distraction had cost the mercenaries their momentum. With an earth-shattering roar, Alistair shifted into his own colossal, pitch-black direwolf. Seeing Abigail, radiant, powerful, and fiercely guarding his children, sent a surge of adrenaline through him that was practically apocalyptic. Together with his guards, the king decimated the remaining rogues in a matter of minutes. Those who survived the initial onslaught surrendered, pressing their bellies to the blood-stained stone in absolute submission to the Black King and the newly awakened White Luna. When the dust settled, Alistair shifted back to his human form, tossing a fur cloak over his broad shoulders. He walked slowly toward the dais, his chest heaving, his stormy eyes locked entirely on Abigail. Abigail stepped back from the children and shifted. The transition was agonizing for a first-timer, but she forced herself to stand tall, clutching a discarded tapestry around her shivering frame. She braced herself for his anger. She was no longer the barren, safe option. She was a fully realized, incredibly powerful she-wolf, capable of bearing her own heirs. "I didn't know," Abigail said quickly, her voice trembling slightly as Alistair approached. "I swear to you, Your Grace, I didn't know my wolf was like this. If you want me to leave to protect their claim—" Alistair didn't let her finish. He reached out, his large, bloodied hands gently gripping her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. It wasn't a gesture of dominance. It was an embrace of profound, staggering relief. "Leave," Alistair murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his lips brushing the crown of her hair. "You just shielded my son with your own body. You awakened the rarest wolf bloodline in a century just to keep my children safe." He pulled back slightly, looking deep into her emerald eyes. For the first time, the king of the ironclad territory looked entirely unguarded. "You are no empty vessel, Abigail," he said, his voice loud enough for the surviving nobility to hear. "You are the mother this pack has bled for, and you are not going anywhere." Behind them, Silas stepped forward and took Abigail's hand. Freya hugged her waist, and Cedric, standing tall, gave his father a firm, decisive nod. The broken family wasn't just mended, it had been reforged in fire and silver. But as the guards dragged the unconscious Lord Blackwood and the trembling Sterlings to the dungeons, Abigail knew the war was far from over. A pure white wolf was a beacon, and in a world ruled by power and ancient prophecies, there would be many who would seek to extinguish her light. The news of the White Wolf's awakening could not be contained within the heavy stone walls of the Iron Keep. It spread across the snow-choked valleys and dark forests of the northern territories like wildfire. To the common folk, it was a miracle, a sign that the moon goddess had finally returned her gaze to their war-torn lands. But to the High Council of the North, a rigid, deeply conservative body of ancient alphas and scholars who governed pack law, it was a severe political threat. 3 days after the attack in the Great Hall, as the blood was still being scrubbed from the cobblestones, the council arrived. They were led by High Inquisitor Nathaniel Reed, an impossibly old, scarred alpha, who strictly adhered to the ancient texts penned by the first chronicler, Bishop Thomas Cranmer. Reed rode into the courtyard flanked by armoured paladins, his face set in a mask of deeply ingrained prejudice. He had never liked King Alistair's progressive rulings, and the idea of a peasant-born, previously barren woman claiming the legendary mantle of a White Luna was heresy to him. Alistair met them at the gates, his massive frame blocking the entrance to the inner keep. "You are uninvited, Nathaniel. The traitor Blackwood is in my dungeons. The rebellion is crushed. Return to your sanctuaries." Nathaniel Reed dismounted, leaning heavily on a staff of twisted black iron. "We are not here for Reginald Blackwood, Your Grace. We are here for the beast you harbour. The texts of Cranmer clearly state that a white Luna is born of royal, ancient bloodline, not from the mud of Oakhaven. We believe the girl is an abomination, manipulated by dark southern magic to enchant your mind and steal the throne." Alistair's eyes flashed a dangerous, predatory crimson. "Careful, old man. Your titles will not protect your throat if you insult my mate." "She is not your mate yet, King Alistair," Reed countered smoothly. "And until she proves her blood in the trial of the Silver Pool, she is a suspect of dark witchcraft. If you deny us this, you deny the absolute laws of the goddess. The other territories will see you as a heretic. They will declare war on the Iron Keep, and your children will be the first to burn." From the arched balcony above, Abigail listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was entirely healed, her body humming with a new, vibrant energy. But she understood the precariousness of her position. Alistair's army was strong, but he could not fight a united front of every northern pack. His children would be hunted forever. "I will do it," Abigail called out, her voice clear and carrying over the howling wind. She descended the stone steps, wearing a simple gown of deep blue wool. Cedric and Silas flanked her like shadows, their hostility toward her entirely replaced by a fierce, undeniable loyalty. Alistair turned to her, his jaw tight with anxiety. "Abigail, no. The Silver Pool is a sacred, volatile relic. It rejects those whose inner wolves are not at absolute peace. The water is laced with raw, concentrated silver dust. If your wolf hesitates, the silver will burn you from the inside out. It is a death sentence." Abigail reached out, placing a warm hand against the king's tense cheek. "They threw me away because they thought I was broken," she whispered softly. "I will not hide behind your sword now that I know I am whole. If I am to be the mother of these children and the queen of this keep, I will leave no room for their doubts." The cavern beneath the Iron Keep was ancient, lit only by bioluminescent moss that clung to the damp walls. At the center lay the Silver Pool, a perfectly circular natural spring. The water wasn't blue, it was a shimmering, metallic quicksilver, radiating a deeply unsettling, ancient magic. High Inquisitor Reed stood at the edge, an ancient scroll in his hands. The entire court, along with Alistair and the children, watched from the raised stone tiers. "Step into the water, Abigail Sterling," Reed commanded, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. "If your wolf is an illusion of dark magic, the silver will boil your blood. If you are a true Luna, the goddess will embrace you." Abigail unclasped her heavy cloak, letting it fall to the cavern floor. She wore only a thin, white linen shift. The cold air raised goosebumps on her skin, but her inner wolf was entirely calm, purring low in her chest, eager for the trial. She stepped forward. Her bare toes broke the surface of the metallic water. Instantly, a sharp, biting pain shot up her leg. The silver recognized the werewolf biology and naturally sought to attack it. A collective gasp echoed from the audience. Alistair gripped the stone railing so hard it cracked beneath his fingers, ready to dive in and pull her out. Council laws be damned. But Abigail closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She didn't fight the silver. She didn't try to dominate it with violence. Instead, she thought of little Leo's nightmares, of Freya's lavender crowns, of Silas's quiet companionship, and Cedric's brave, trembling stand against the rogue. She channeled every ounce of maternal love, fiercely protective and overwhelmingly pure, pushing that emotion outward into her aura. The pain vanished. The metallic water began to glow with a brilliant, blinding emerald light, matching the exact shade of her wolf's eyes. As Abigail waded deeper until the water reached her waist, the pool did not boil. Instead, it smoothed out like glass. Then, the water began to rise. It spiraled upward around her, defying gravity, weaving through the air like liquid ribbons. The silver water crystallized in the air, forming the faint, luminous shapes of massive ancient wolves, the spirits of the true Lunars who had come before her, bowing their heads in reverence to the woman in the center of the pool. High Inquisitor Reed dropped his iron staff. It clattered loudly against the stone. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his scarred face, entirely undone by the sheer divinity of the spectacle. Abigail opened her eyes, her pupils fully dilated, glowing with ethereal power. "I am Abigail of the Ironclad," she spoke, but her voice was layered with the harmonious, echoing voices of 1,000 ancient mothers. "And my blood is pure." The aftermath of the trial of the Silver Pool brought a swift and brutal end to the political maneuvering within the Northern Territories. High Inquisitor Reed personally struck Reginald Blackwood's name from the noble registries, condemning the traitor to the deep mines of the Western Mountains for the remainder of his days. But there was still the matter of Thomas and Martha Sterling. They were brought before the throne 2 days before the winter solstice. The Great Hall, previously a site of bloodshed, had been scrubbed clean and decorated with heavy boughs of pine and winter berries. Alistair sat on his dark throne, but this time an intricately carved chair of white oak had been placed beside him. Abigail sat upon it, draped in rich furs, a heavy silver circlet resting upon her dark hair. Her parents looked ragged, starved, and terrified. They fell to their knees, not daring to look at the daughter they had sold. "The penalty for utilizing maiden silence is death by the executioner's block," Alistair stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. He looked to Abigail. "But they are your blood, my queen. The judgment is yours." Abigail looked at the 2 people who had given her life, only to steal it away for a handful of silver coins. She felt no rage anymore, only a profound, cold pity. "To kill you would be a mercy, for it would end your suffering," Abigail said, her voice calm and authoritative. "But you do not deserve mercy. You worshipped gold above your own kin. You will not find death here. You are stripped of your pack names. You are banished to the barren eastern steppes. You will live the rest of your lives with no pack, no protection, and no family. You will scrape a living from the frozen dirt, and every time the winter wind bites your skin, you will remember the daughter you threw away." Thomas wailed, begging for the block instead, knowing the steps meant a slow, agonizing existence of starvation and isolation. Martha simply hung her head, finally broken. The guards dragged them away, and Abigail didn't look back. Her past was officially dead. That evening, beneath the brilliant dancing lights of the Aurora Borealis, the mating ceremony took place in the snow-covered courtyards of the keep. It was not a political affair of stuffy nobles, but a raw, beautiful pack tradition. Alistair and Abigail stood before the ancient weirwood tree, their hands bound together by a single braided cord of silver and black leather. Alistair looked down at her. The harsh, warlord exterior entirely melted away. In his eyes, Abigail saw the man who had grieved for 5 years, who had fought the entire world to keep his children safe, and who had finally found the piece of his soul that had been missing. "I claim you, Abigail," Alistair whispered, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Not as an empty vessel, not as a political shield, but as my equal. My heart, my Luna, my mate. I accept you, Alistair," she replied, her voice thick with emotion, tears of genuine joy freezing on her eyelashes. "My king, my alpha, my home." He leaned down, and as their lips met, a profound, electric shockwave of energy pulsed through the courtyard, their wolves intertwined on a spiritual level, snapping the mating bond firmly into place. The surrounding pack members tilted their heads back and let out a deafening, unified howl of absolute triumph that echoed off the jagged mountains. Later, as the feast raged inside, Abigail slipped away to the royal nursery. The adrenaline of the day was fading, replaced by a deep, contented exhaustion. She slowly pushed the heavy oak doors open. The room was peaceful. Silas was asleep at his desk, a book resting under his cheek. Freya was curled up in her bed, clutching a stuffed velvet wolf. Cedric stood by the window, keeping watch, but as Abigail entered, his shoulders relaxed. He offered her a small, genuine smile before quietly slipping out the door to join the festivities. Abigail walked over to little Leo's bed. The 4-year-old was awake, staring up at the stone ceiling. As she sat on the edge of his mattress, he rolled over and scrambled into her lap, burying his face in the soft velvet of her gown. Abigail wrapped her arms around his small, warm body, resting her chin on his head. She began to hum the old lullaby, the song of the winter snows. Leo looked up at her, his big golden eyes blinking sleepily. He reached up, his tiny fingers playing with the silver circlet on her head. "Good night, Mother," he whispered, his eyes fluttering shut. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but it was a tear of absolute, unadulterated joy. She pulled the blanket up over his shoulders, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. She had been sold for 30 pieces of silver, deemed worthless and broken. But here, in the cold, unyielding north, she had found her true worth. Abigail Sterling's journey from a discarded, barren peasant to the revered White Queen of the ironclad territory is a testament to the enduring power of the maternal spirit. Her story proves that a woman's worth is not defined by the immediate utility of her biology, nor by the cruel labels placed upon her by selfish men. By choosing to fiercely protect the vulnerable children of a broken king, Abigail awakened a latent, legendary power within herself, forging a found family stronger than any forged by mere bloodline. In the end, the very trait that made her worthless in the eyes of her greedy parents, her supposedly empty womb, became the catalyst that saved a dynasty. The Iron Keep, once a tomb of grief, transformed into a beacon of hope, ruled by an alpha king and his fiercely devoted, fiercely loved, pure white Luna,